When we think of alcoholics, we have a tendency to slot them into one of two categories. There are the troubled alcoholics, drinkers who never find lasting recovery, and eventually end their life as a statistic. Then there are the successful alcoholics, like Stephen King. These are alcoholics who started off as functional, everyday drinkers. Then they hit rock bottom, discovered an inner strength, and eventually quit drinking altogether. Over time, these successful alcoholics become examples for others to follow. We're pointing at Stephen King as our example of a successful alcoholic because King has been very candid about his past addiction and alcoholism. He admitted publicly that he doesn't remember writing Cujo because of his cocaine use. And King once shared in a Guardian interview that he hit rock bottom when he attended his son's Little League game. He had arrived with a can of beer in a brown paper bag. The coach came over to King and said, quote, "If that's an alcoholic beverage, you're going to have to leave." We'll have a link to the full Guardian interview in our show notes. The irony is, Stephen King has written books about both sides of alcoholic, both the troubled alcoholic and the successful quitter. In The Shining, we see Mad Jack Torrance, an abusive husband whose drinking and rage haunts the family worse than the ghost of Overlook Hotel. Jack is our model troubled alcoholic. And here's a spoiler if you haven't seen The Shining. Jack's alcoholism contributes to his death. Then in Stephen King's sequel, Dr. Sleep, we catch up with Jack's son, Danny. Danny becomes a model of the successful alcoholic. Danny's drinking doesn't kill him like his father. Instead, he joins a 12-step program, goes into recovery, and becomes the literal hero of the story. This dual identity of addiction, the troubled alcoholic who loses the battle, and the successful alcoholic who overcomes, is ingrained in our public zeitgeist. Ingrained enough that a horror writer, whose job it is to tap into our collective subconscious, made this duality the cornerstone of his career. But what if I told you this duality of the tormented alcoholic and the recovered alcoholic is all wrong? What if I told you that both Jack Torrance and Danny Torrance had the exact same neurological switch that made them drinkers? And it's the same switch that many writers have in their brains, a switch that might be the reason so many geniuses are also drinkers. Now, what if I told you that in a few years we could turn that switch off? You're listening to The Re-Engineered You. This is a podcast about self-empowerment and all the myths, lies, misconceptions we tell ourselves. Then we use science and history to bust those myths and re-engineer a better you. I'm your host, Todd Laments, the extrovert, and I'm joined by researcher, writer, and introvert, Joe Anthony.
Good evening, Todd.
Joe, how are you?
I'm doing good. How are you?
I'm good. Today we're talking about alcoholism, and not in the way you might think. We've devoted our entire episode to a series of studies that have exposed the fundamental connection that all alcoholic brains share, as well as a potential cure for alcoholism, which could have already proven itself. First, we'll start with the myth Stephen King has tapped into, the myth of the binary alcoholic, that successful alcoholics can beat their demons through grit, willpower, and social support, whereas troubled alcoholics relapse due to a weakness in their character. Secondly, we'll discuss the neurology of alcoholism. We'll ask questions like, does college partying create alcoholics? Are my kids driving me to drink? And why are so many great writers alcoholics? Finally, we'll look at the future of treatment for alcoholism and why all of our best programs and medicines might look quaint or dangerous in another 10 years. To kick this discussion off, Joe is going to tell us about the study that inspired today's episode.
Okay, so first off, I would like to ask you a quick question, Todd.
Yes.
Do you have any letters in front of your name?
Letters?
Yeah, like a DR or an MD?
No. I'm street educated. I'm not a PhD medical doctor. I know where you're going with this.
Okay. I want to say the same thing about me. I am not Dr. Anthony. And anything you guys listen to today, this comes from nerdy researchers online who are banging their heads against weird articles. So I encourage you to listen to this with discrimination. Stay away from Facebook and news websites. And anything you hear that interests you, please look it up and read more. Read our sources, because we want you to challenge us. We like it when people look into what we're doing. So this is all based on an Atlantic article that I read. It's called a landmark study in the origins of alcoholism. And it was so fascinating and so eye-opening for alcoholism. I want to share it with you. So, alcoholism as a struggle, it's more of a rainbow than a binary. You've talked about Stephen King, how he lays out the idea that there is a successful alcoholic and a failed, troubled alcoholic. And something that struck me with this article is they talk about how it's really more just a 15% across all mammals that turn into alcoholics or have the potentiality to do that. So have you ever heard of monkeys or like show animals getting drunk?
I have. Like there's a bear at a certain bar in Russia that they give it booze, and it's like it's an attraction, but then it becomes an alcoholic because it drinks all the time.
Right.
It gets sick and doesn't perform if it hasn't had a couple drinks.
Right. I think there's even like a Simpsons joke about that, like a bear mauling somebody because it's drunk. But it's cute, but it's pretty tragic too.
And then I've heard things over in Thailand and stuff, monkeys that get addicted to, because the tourists will give them beer,
right,
thinking it's funny, and then they become alcoholic little monkeys.
Right. Same thing with like vacation islands where you'll see monkeys get they get too used to drinking, and then they'll come over and like kite people's drinks, and it's annoying for everybody. Well, that kind of points out something that they got to in this study. So they looked at rats, and rat studies for alcoholism have always been sort of fraught with difficulties. It's very tough to find alcoholism in the brain. It's nearly impossible. What they would do in the past is they would give these studies where they have rats in a tank and a switch. And the switch would dispense either food or alcohol, or it would dispense cocaine. And these studies usually result in 100% addiction rates. That they would just convert all rats into addicts because they just have... I mean, like, I would do the same, right? Like, if I were trapped in a glass tank...
Yeah, because your choice between that and that...
Right. Yeah, you're in a sensory deprived area. All you have is a single switch that gives you a chemical that will entertain you. Which
makes you think about kids who grow up in an addictive family where there's addiction everywhere, right?
Right. There's one lever everyone's hitting, and that kid just sees that get hit all the time. So the problem with studies in the past have been that they've only had one component to them, and that's whether or not a rat gets addicted or not. So this Atlantic article, they talk about a study by Marcus Hellig, who works with the National Institute of Health. And he had worked on these other studies with the rats, and he wanted to find a way to identify which rats were actual addictive alcoholics. Not just would they hit a switch if they were given literally nothing else, would they hit a switch if they had another option? And that's something that alcoholics have in real life, which is if they don't want to drink, there are other substances they can substitute with. They can do marijuana, or they can get addicted to painkillers, or they can eat high-calorie foods. So that's what Marcus Hellig did. Normally, rats in this situation, you wouldn't want to introduce another variable to muddy up a test. But what this did is it emulated sort of real circumstances. And we get a situation where he finds 15% of rats were natural alcoholics. So,
given other choices, they would still choose to. That'd still be choice number one, door number one.
Exactly. Given the choice between sugar water, which was calorically dense, it was as good calorically as drinking the alcohol, if not better, or they could have the booze, 15% stayed with the hooch. And So that's where you get that 15% of monkeys on the beach, 15% of rats, 15% of alcoholic bears.
Sounds a lot like American diet, though. Coca-Cola, cocaine, or booze, right?
Right, you've got your choices. if
All unhealthy.
Yeah. If you're a recovering alcoholic, you're drinking a pot of coffee. Or there's donuts at every AA meeting. So this supplementing is what allowed scientists to really get into this. And they found that 15% of rats became natural alcoholics, and they would continue drinking even if they electrified the booze. So even to the point where real humans become addicted, where they prove that they're in that 15%, is when they drink even though a doctor has said, you're hurting yourself.
This is going to kill you.
Right.
Keep it up. We won't be around much longer.
Right, their blood pressure is soaring, their liver is screaming, and they're still doing it.
They just can't stop.
Right. So that's where we start finding, this big breakthrough is here we can actually see the 15% of alcoholics, and it's a genetic component. There's something in them making them, continue drinking. And so once they could identify that, for the first time ever, they said there's something biologically different with these rats. That's when they could open up their brains, of course, and find out what's wrong.
Well, hold up on that one, the brain trigger one. We're going to get back to that, but just hold up for 1 second.
Sure.
Now, Stephen King is an alcoholic writer, writing about an alcoholic writer who's working on his novel. This is the inception of brain anxieties.
It's like those multiple mirrors looking in on themselves.
We're filming a video of a video, right?
Right.
Why are so many creative people great drinkers? It's like they can't turn that thing off. Writers like Faulkner, Hemingway, or Douglas Adams, who admitted to inventing the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe while he was sitting in a field drunk, staring up at the stars. Or alcoholic painters like Van Gogh or Jackson Pollock. Famous politicians, Richard Nixon, Winston Churchill, known alcoholics. And when you get into the entertainment business and creative souls like Robin Williams, Mel Gibson, Bradley Cooper, Billy Joel, Amy Winehouse, list goes on and on of alcoholic artists. Now, of course, the most famous one, writing-wise, known for his drinking, is, of course, Hemingway.
Right.
Right. He's a better writer after a drink. And I think we all kind of have that romanticized, if I could be a genius if I just got drunk enough, right?
Right, it would reveal the genius in me if I just got loaded.
Right. But there's a lot more to it than that, right? As you as a writer would know.
Right. I remember reading this a criticism of Hemingway. Somebody accused him of being a drunk writer, and he said, "No, I don't drink when I write. I write sober, edit. Write drunk, edit sober, something like that." He always made these wisecracks. Yeah. But he actually criticized Faulkner. Hemingway said, as much of an alcoholic he said that he could tell when Faulkner had started drinking on the page. Like he could be reading Faulkner and he'd see on the paragraph, there he took his first drink because it's getting a little bit loose.
Because he knows his style and he's a pro himself.
Right.
It's funny because today I was listening to Jimmy Buffett, and he's Margarita in Paradise, and he's known as a drinking thing. Most of his songs are about drinking and stuff, and he's kind of made a living off the alcoholic image.
Right.
And then it turns out that he's worth $500 million. So, and he hasn't been in the pop charts ever in his whole life. So it's just he's made that image. But I think it's the same sort of thing as Hemingway. He just talks about drinking lots in his songs.
Right. So it's part of the image.
Yeah, it's part of the branding.
Right.
Many of these creatives were not just drinkers, but they were dependent alcoholics, which makes us wonder, is there a fundamental difference between our brains and theirs? So
I'm going to quote directly from the article now. And again, I can't stress this enough. Go read it. It's on theatlantic.com. And this is just a couple paragraphs because I really don't want to botch the science of this to mislead you. So this all takes place in the amygdala. The mechanism we're talking about. And it says in here, quote, "The amygdala is an almond-shaped region that sits deep within the brain and is heavily involved in processing emotions." And then they go on to talk about this thing called GABA, which is a molecular mechanism. So I'm going to quote again. Quote, GABA is a molecular red light. Certain neurons make and release it to stop their neighbors from firing. Once that's done, the GABA-making neurons use an enzyme called GAT3 to pump the molecule back into themselves so they can reuse it. But in the amygdala of the alcohol-preferring rats, the gene that makes GAT3 is much less active, and it makes just half the usual levels of the pump. GABA accumulates around the neighboring neurons, making them abnormally inactive. So, what I can tell, the layman of this, because I am a layman, is that alcoholic brains are also nervous brains. And I think this is going to be kind of like a no-duh moment for a lot of people that are familiar with alcoholism or alcoholics. The notion that an alcoholic is a nervous brain, that probably comes as no shock.
But they are that way before they started drinking. It's not from the drinking. I think that's something to...
Right. If what we've talked about, the idea that you have these monkeys that will get addicted, these rats that will get addicted, mammals basically across the spectrum, humans across the spectrum. This is something that's always existed in us. It's 15% of mammals, apparently, and it's across the board. So it is a mechanism built into us as a species.
And every recovered alcoholic that I've known has always said that they have to be careful that they don't channel that obsession, addiction into something else, whether it's sex, gambling, overeating. They're very susceptible to another vice.
Right. And I'm really glad you said it that way, that you can channel it. Because I'm starting to think that is possibly a mechanism in sort of this genius alcoholic theme we're running. Now, something else I'd like to put out. The notion that you have functional or successful alcoholics, that actually might be channeling. This is speculating. I also want to point out, while I was exploring this article, I was pitching this notion to my uncle and my aunt. My uncle is he introduced me to science articles when I was very young. I was like 12 and I'm reading Goosebumps. And he's like, no, put that aside. That's kid stuff. And he's like, try this Scientific American. So I'm telling them about this podcast that we're working on. And I'm talking about, hey, isn't this neat? They have this study that shows that alcoholism might just be a nervousness in the brain, that it doesn't process, GABA and this GAC3 thing. It's a mechanism that makes us nervous. And when I started talking about that, potentially, people who are also brilliant and alcoholics, this connection, when I started saying maybe it's a mechanism of they're focusing, they're channeling, they're built nervous, and so like the Eye of Sauron, they're focusing on something. And when I started saying that maybe that's the connection, he was ironically this programmer. He's a programmer. He's walking through the kitchen, drinking a beer, and behind him is a beer pyramid that he has drank throughout the night. And then he shouts out from the kitchen. He's like, speculating about science, like it's not upheld. And so I do want to put that caveat in here, is that at this point, this is an opinion, that this notion that alcoholics are humanity's warriors, that there are prairie dogs on alert, there are hypervigilance. That is me speculating. The part about anxiety is not speculating. That's just been proven.
You're entitled to your opinion, though.
And
what the research says.
And I will take that entitlement as far as I can. So, you also mentioned that you've talked about how adulthood and parenthood, and specifically maybe college drinking, you had a friend who thought that was what made an alcoholic.
Yeah, a very dear friend of mine. She produces documentaries, and she talks about the binge drinking of college fraternities, and how it's romanticized, and how guys brag about how effed up I got last night. And she said, and we couldn't see that these guys 10, 15 years from now are going to be alcoholics. I mean, come on. It's pretty obvious.
Right. It's almost like college is minting alcoholics. Like they are stamping them out with beer funnels.
Yeah.
Well, that's...
And then in the business world, too, by personally, being in outside sales and stuff. And that's changed. through the years. I mean, it used to be you had a couple beers, you got wasted during lunchtime when you're a salesperson.
Right.
And which always cracks me up because now these new businesses these new, I guess you'd say, millennial, they try to attract a certain kind of people. Say, oh, we do shots on Fridays, and we did that stuff in the 90s all the time. We didn't need to do it on Friday.
Right.
We did it all day long every day.
Right. It's like the Wolf of Wall Street. Where
Exactly.
it's nothing but...
They think sex and violence and drugs are a new thing. Oh no, we've been doing this stuff for a while.
Right. That's the hip new thing to do in Silicon Valley. Is everybody has drugs at their desk. Like it's.
If you're saying it's cool, it's not cool, right?
Right. Oh no, I'm not going to judge the coolness. I will, however. The point I'm trying to make is that we expose that 15% of people to these patterns,
and it's acceptable and it gets attention. So that's a good place to get a foothold in too.
Right. I've also spoken with teachers. One of the best places to hang out briefly is at a teacher's lounge, because you get to hear all of them talk about how much they drink after work. And God bless teachers, they probably have earned it.
Between the parents and the kids, yeah, I think so.
Right. But the point we're making today is that college does not make you a lifelong alcoholic. Teaching does not make you an alcoholic. Adulthood and being a parent does not necessarily make you an alcoholic. It may make you drink. You may have something that triggers that in your life, or you reach for it as a coping mechanism. But what it seems to truly expose whether or not you're an alcoholic is repetitive activity that sets the pattern.
And on that point too, the parent who says, "Well, I drank when I was in college too, or I did drugs. I did cocaine a few times in college." There's a difference between that person and an everyday user drinker.
Right.
It's not someone who really has a habit, not that does something once, to someone who does something every single day.
Right. It's the difference between exposure and opportunity and an everyday habit. Somebody that has to do it. We talked about the rats where the beer was electrified, and they're still doing it. So that's not the same as a college drinker who is just taking a beer shot.
It's funny. I've never thought about that till you brought that up today, that in those little white boxes, you would be bored out of your mind. I don't care what kind of animal.
Right.
I never thought about that. It's like they have nothing to do.
Yeah. That thing could dispense a Pez. It could be literally that you would hit the
anything.
Yeah. So yeah, that's the opinion we're going off of today, is that alcoholics are humanity's warriors. And before we move on, I want to bring up one last point about alcohol being across all mammals. Have you heard of these bears that sniff jet fuel?
No, I've not.
So this is one of those delightfully Russian things. But when they were retiring their jets, they had to find a place to store their jet fuel. So there are these canisters of jet fuel just laying out in fields, because if you're not being paid by the hour, why find a silo or a warehouse?
I'm envisioning this somewhere in Siberia. Right?
Right, it's somewhere in Russia.
It's deep out there. There's no waste management thing. They just throw
right.
shit wherever, right?
Yeah. Comrades.
They don't bury anything.
Yeah.
Or there's no OSHA or any kind of environmental laws. You just throw the shit out in the field.
Exactly. It's like the redneck stores their car in the lawn kind of logic, except that it's a whole country. We're going to lose all of our Russian audience now. Except
all one of them. All two of them.
All two of them, yeah. So they have these jet fuel canisters just laying out, and they found out that apparently bears will go up and sniff them and just get really loaded and roll around in the field. And
wow.
It's adorable and weirdly tragic, but I will just say it's probably 15% of bears, so not all bears.
If you're anything, you're consistent in your theories, right? In your beliefs.
Right. I don't want to veer off. Yeah.
If you're an alcoholic, one of the first defense mechanisms of drinking is to joke about your problem. Make light of it. Make people laugh about your habits. After all, it's hard for someone else to call you on your problem if you're the first one to admit it. Now, I can relate to this one as people who are at the bar every night. That's kind of part of their identity is drinking. Kind of the Jimmy Buffett I was talking about. Drinking every night, or they're the life of the party. They're the hardcore partier. They can drink more than anybody else.
Right.
And they'll brag about it.
Right, if you're Dean Martin, you're drinking apple juice out of a glass to make people think you're drinking whiskey. Yeah. It's so part of your personality.
I've often wondered that about like Ron White and stuff. If he's pretending to be drunk sometimes, and he might not be a good example, but there's a lot of those guys that's just so much of their image.
It's your shtick, yeah.
Yeah, and if they couldn't perform, if they were, but they couldn't perform if they were that loaded. They couldn't be that good, that polished.
Right.
I don't know. Have you read Stephen King's book on writing?
I have.
What did you think of it?
I thought it was brilliant. The part that I particularly like, I'm an outline writer myself, so okay. I have to have a framework to work on. I love that he craps all over outline writers. He says he doesn't believe in it, and that when he dies and goes to heaven, he's going to make sure those guys were faking it, that they were making up that they had a plan.
So that didn't offend you? You didn't get on the defensive?
Not at all. I thought it was delightful.
Well, for the listeners, I'll tell you about the book. It's one of my favorite. I grew up in Maine, and I'm a big Stephen King fan. I'm not a big fan of horror fiction, but I'm just a big fan of his stuff. I grew up by listening to it, and then it used a lot of the small towns where I knew when I was a kid, because Maine is all small towns.
Oh, yeah.
But the book is 50% writing style, which I'm not a writer, you are, and the other one is just kind of a bio of his life. And to me, it's very inspiring and self-help. Someone who went from nothing, living in a trailer, to a major book deal but he talks about his life and his battles with addiction and just kind of putting one foot in front of the other. I guess the one thing I really came out of is what a great work ethic he had.
Yeah.
To just turn out this much content over all these years.
But he was also drinking through that whole period, right? So he must have had something that let him sort of get away with that while he was working?
Yeah, he did. He was once quoted as saying, "I like to drink alone. I never get ugly when I drink too much. I never bore myself with a lot of dull conversation, and I have never yet been invited to step outside with myself."
So that goes back to the humor part, that he's using humor, so if he calls himself out on his drinking, nobody else will.
Yeah. Humor, evasion, cleverness, and competency are all ways for an alcoholic to evade facing the real problem. And once these evasions have stopped working, then it's time to enter rehab or AA 12-step. Like, if you still have a good job, if you're still successful, you can always justify, there's nothing wrong with me. I just like to have my beer. Right.
Yeah, when I was drinking, I got away with it because I was clever. And it was easier. I mean, it worked until it didn't.
Explain the didn't part. Explain what didn't work anymore.
Well, I eventually had to go into recovery because it was not being called out on your problems, on your drinking or whatever your addiction is. I mean, I definitely fall into that 15% we've been talking about. And it's tough because when no one calls you on it, it's up to you. Like, you really just have to be your own metric for that.
Well, as being another 15%er myself and a family full of 15%ers, I know what you mean. And the problem I always had was if nobody says anything, you think you're kind of fooling everybody.
Exactly.
But not everybody's comfortable. Not everybody's comfortable doing an intervention or sitting down. They just want you to go away.
Right.
So you think you're fooling anybody even though you're acting weird, you're not showing up, you smell and look a little funny. At least
right.
that's where I was at.
I think it's a very fair way to put that.
12-step programs can be life-saving. Rehab programs can give you time you need. It can give you a real break. You can step away from your habits, and you can gain some much-needed clarity. But 12-step and rehab success rates have come into question over the last 10 years. According to Dr. Lance Dodds, author of The Sobering Truth, AA has about a 5 to 10% success rate. For that small, only 5 to 10%, AA really works. It really gets results. The social component and the camaraderie can give the recovering alcoholics the perspective they need to change their lives for the better. Now, I know about this from the AA program. What you do is you replace the people you hang out with. You change your circle from the bar people and the partying people that you go hang out with to the sober people. So you don't go to the bar after work, you go to an AA meeting and you circle yourself up in those friends and you get busy with those friends. They have activities, they have AA dances, they have AA hiking, AA motorcycle, anything AA, they have yoga, anything you want to do, they're going to create a new whole circle of friends for you.
Right, so they give you that sort of fishbowl thing. They surround your environment.
And I think what's deceiving about the 5 to 10% thing is that it's kind of like, to me, it's like when you go to a dietitian and they write you out this diet. And you go home and you go right to Jack in the Box, right to McDonald's, and eat whatever you want. And you say, you know what? Those dietitians don't know what they're talking about. So I think it's fair to say, and this is from my own personal experience, and I'll share with you later about that, but the people who actually do what they say are the ones that get better.
Right, the ones that are follow the program and listen to the advice.
Yeah.
But the guy we're talking about, Lance Dodds, for those that it doesn't work for, his point, I think that you have to actually listen to the steps and listen to the advice and follow it. But if it doesn't work for you, if you aren't one of those 5 to 10%, you've just lost control. Like you walk out feeling like, okay, well, if that didn't work, there's nothing else.
Right.
Because it's the only game in town for most societies across the globe right now.
Well, and I can tell you this too, Joe. To me, it's a lot like the internet. There's a lot of good information, but there's probably twice as much bad information. So if you go in there and you get hooked up with the wrong person who, rubs you the wrong way, gives you bad advice, has their own personal agenda.
Right.
There's a lot of pitfalls in there too.
Right. So you have to go in with an open mind. You have to be wary of who you listen to and follow it for what it's worth.
For those who wash out of the 12-step program, they can leave feeling powerless and out of control, which is why we turn to the science to ask the question, will there ever be a better solution?
So I want to tell you a little bit about a cardiologist named Oliver Armisen. He was a kind of a Doogie Howser kind of doctor. He entered the University of Paris when he was 16.
That's smart.
Yeah, a little bit of a smart guy. And then he ended up moving to the U.S. to do his practice. So he was known as being this young genius. And in 1997, he was working in his clinic in Manhattan, and he rang up his secretary and told her he wouldn't be able to come into work. And she thought he was sick. And when she asked why, he said he thinks drinking would interfere with his work. And she laughed at him. By his own accounts, she laughed at him. It's kind of like if Doogie Howser called you up and said, "I can't be a genius right now.
Right.
I've been drinking too much."
Yeah, this guy had it all figured out. He's a perfect person, right?
Right.
Brilliant physician, young, prodigy.
Right. And
international, multilingual language. I can see this cat.
Right, he's got a French accent.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, he's just cool. Like, yeah, he's got it all figured out.
Right, and he told her that he didn't want to have somebody say, "Hey, my chest hurts," and then he drunkenly tells them, "Go play tennis." Yeah. So, in his words, that's basically how he put it.
Good for him.
Yeah, he recognized that in himself, which is a good thing. And knowing that it would interfere with his work, he was a daily drinker. He tried to quit through AA. He said he went to 700 meetings per year for about 7 years. That's approximately 4 meetings a day. It didn't work. He kept drinking. The urge was too much. So he moved back to Paris.
So he didn't dabble in AA. He worked the program. He went. I mean,
yeah,
4 meetings a day. That's 4 hours of already busy. Probably works 10, 12 hours as a doctor. He took this very seriously.
Right. He basically lives at AA at this point, and
totally immersed, surrounded in it.
Right. He is part of the culture. And when it didn't work, he went back to Paris. And while convalescing in Paris, he tried multiple drugs. Again, he was a doctor, so he knew his stuff, and he wasn't trying these willy-nilly.
He knew the body and the mind, and he knew his people he's worked with, other physicians, the best.
Yes. He had contacts.
And he had a high income. Safe to say, too, right?
Safe to say. Well, at this point, he...
all the resources, right?
Yeah. His family must have, because he was a doctor, but at this point, he had lost his practice when he moved back to Paris. So he is trying different medications that would help him.
Grabbing at straws, looking for anything to get better. Right.
And what he found is now a slightly controversial drug for alcoholism, which is baclofen. And baclofen, Armisen said it cured his cravings. Now, this comes with a caveat that this has not been proven yet that baclofen works. He took it, and it cut off his cravings for quite a few years. And then he started lowering his dose as he went. And he said it completely worked. It shut off his cravings. He didn't drink anymore. He was able to start collaborating with other doctors on medicine. And when they tried to replicate his study at the North Carolina School of Medicine, they started testing people at 30 milligrams per day of baclofen to see if it would lower their alcoholic cravings. Whereas Armisen was using 270 milligrams a day. And at his absolute lowest, when he had weaned himself down, he had gotten down to 70 milligrams per day, and he swore by it. So that's still more than double what they did for their test group. So they have not proven that this works yet. Nonetheless, the takeaway for me here is that's an anti-anxiety medication. So most medications we've tried for alcoholics, they are not anti-anxieties. They're sometimes, well, have you heard of any medications that make you sicker when you drink?
Yeah, I personally prescribe myself on Antabuse. Do you know what Antabuse is?
What's that?
Antabuse is something that you get court ordered usually by a judge because you've been in bar fights or there's domestic violence. What I did is I took it because I was having a problem. I couldn't stop drinking. And what happens, you take this pill, and what it does is it turns so if you drink alcohol, it doesn't go through your liver. It just kind of poisons you. And let me tell you, so what happens is it says don't drink on Antabuse. Don't do it because you have to go to the hospital. Your heart starts pounding. Your hands and face swell up. It feels like you're going to die. I know this from personal experience.
Wow.
Yeah. But what's funny is that you read reviews on the internet about stuff.
Right.
Read any review on Antabuse and what people say. They all say the exact same thing. It's horrible. You feel like you're going to die. There's none that say, oh, it's not so bad, or you can do it once in a while. They all say, don't do it. Right. It's the only thing that's in 100% agreement on the internet.
Right. All of the internet says don't do it.
But what it's for is to give you that break. When you take this, you can't drink. And so if you're quartered to take this for 90 days, you're going to have 90 days of sobriety. They used it over in European countries. It's shown for a lot better results, but only because they used it for long enough.
Right.
They used it for 9 months to a year. And in the States, they only use it for a few months, so then people go right back to the old habits. They get so far out of that pattern that they don't go back to that same stuff.
Okay. So it has to set up the pattern, set up the habit.
It's a very harsh drug. For me, it was hard, and if you keep taking it, it's very hard on your liver. You're likely to get a liver cancer.
Okay.
So it's a last. But again, if it keeps you alive and gets you in the game,
right,
it's better than the alternative.
So I'll state again that Todd and I are not doctors, but what this does tell me is this study, not a study, a anecdote of this one doctor. That might be a good indicator that alcoholism does come from a nervous tick in the brain. That if this is an anti-anxiety, and the repercussions, the reason we don't sling baclofen over the counter is it can mess with your muscle responses. So it does come with drawbacks. But it might be a study that we, as we sort of go forward the next 10 or 20 years, it might be something that proves itself out. And of course, if you have problems and AA hasn't worked yet, you can always find a doctor, work with your doctors, work with a licensed professional to help you set up a plan. Is my takeaway for this.
And there's unlimited, for if you want help, there's so many people different help on addiction stuff in our country.
Right. There's not just AA and nothing or cold turkey and nothing. There's all types of paths.
Yeah. In Stephen King's book, Dr. Sleep, the protagonist, Danny, finds a mentor who helps start his journey through the 12-step recovery. But in real life, Stephen King's journey to sobriety went a little differently. Now, personally, and I don't know Stephen King, but I can't see him as a school teacher leaving school and heading to the bar. I see him as an introverted writer-reader. I don't see him going to nightclubs and partying. I see him going into his office, writing, drinking, doing drugs.
Right. He's one of those sit in his favorite chair and kind of drink kind of guys.
Yeah, and just dive into his and be locked up in his office for the whole weekend, drunk and high and writing.
Right.
It's like Steve and stop, put the typewriter away back in the day, you know. It wasn't until his wife, Tabitha King, staged an intervention by gathering up all of his drug paraphernalia and dumped it in front of him, in front of his family and friends.
Oh, so the shame technique.
Yeah, the intervention. So that kind of, and he talked about earlier with at the kids' game.
Right.
He just couldn't do that to himself anymore.
That's understandable.
Yeah, he wasn't traveling around the world and doing all this stuff. Now, we put in the show notes, we have a good link here about how good the intervention worked and how he began his path towards sobriety. So he has been sober for a long time, and so we're going to include that in our show notes.
Oh, so the intervention did work.
It did.
Oh, excellent.
He hasn't been back, and he probably still wouldn't be around if he kept drinking and drugging at that pace.
And that would have been a tragedy because we wouldn't have seen him making fun of himself in It Too.
Alcoholism isn't limited to hopeless drunks who have lost everything or abusive husbands who go on rampages. Alcoholism exists in artists, politicians, teachers, and writers. Alcoholism exists in high-function CEOs, leaders, and parents who have never hit their kids. Alcoholism exists in 15% of humanity. It isn't a shameful defect or a lack of willpower, and it may be tied to anxiety in a very real, very treatable way. If you think you have a drinking problem, remember that demonizing your behavior might not be the solution. Intervention may or may not work for you. A 12-step, which can be 5 to 10% successful, may or may not work. But there's no duality of alcoholics. There's no such thing as a successful or the problem drinker, unless that's the label you've assigned to yourself. Addiction is a sliding scale, and understanding your addiction and mechanisms behind your urges can be the first significant step to managing it. Finally, when you're ready to seek help, never quit trying to quit. If you've never been through a 12-step or recovery, get into the program. If you've tried it and it doesn't work, seek professional assistance. A good therapist or doctor can work with you to chart your cravings, your habits, your mechanism, and help you navigate around your unique brand of addiction in a realistic and meaningful way. There is help out there when you're ready for it. You should never feel alone in a maze with your ghost. Thank you for listening to The Re-Engineered You. You can find us on re-engineeredyou.com. Reach out to us, Joe.
You can find us on Instagram. You can find us on Twitter. You can also find us on our own personal websites through The Re-Engineered You, our main website.
Yeah, and we'd like to hear from you. We like your pushback. We like your opinions. We even like your opinions on show ideas. We don't know everything, but we have an opinion on everything.
And because of that, we would love to argue with you.
And if you like this show, refer us to somebody, give us a good review. But the biggest compliment you can give us is telling someone about the show.
Absolutely.